Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Leading Together podcast, Insights for Delaware's Tomorrow. I'm Julia Kelleher, Executive Director of First Aid Educate. And in each of these episodes, we sit down with Delaware's top minds and leaders so that they can share their perspectives to help advance FSE's mission, which is about building capacity, raising awareness, and elevating school board leadership across the state. And today, we're honored to spend time with Rod Ward, who is the president and CEO of CSC. Now, Rod has an impressive career that spans decades of leadership in both corporate and community roles. Since 2010, he's led CSC, which is a global provider of business administration and compliance solutions, expanding the reach worldwide. But Rod also makes significant contributions to Delaware's business and education sectors. He co-chairs the Delaware Prosperity Partnership with Governor John Carney. It's a public-private initiative dedicated to economic development. Previously, he served as board chair of Rodell, a nonprofit that advances education. And currently, he's the advisory board chair of Delaware CAN. He previously held board positions at the Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance at the University of Delaware and Leadership Delaware. So in today's episode, we'll dive into his experiences and perspectives and explore his journey in public education, economic development, and board leadership. And through this conversation, we hope you'll gain practical insights on collaboration, governance, and the role of effective leadership. Insights that are sure to empower your community and your leadership journey. So Rod, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, Julia, that was quite an introduction. I'm not sure I'm a top mind, but I have been at this a while in Delaware. And as I like to say, as a business person, I know a lot about education. As a professional educator and someone like yourself, maybe not as much, but someone who's paid attention to this over decades, it's something that I've been involved in and care very much deeply about. So glad to be with you today.
Thank you very much. And I know every conversation I've had with you, I've always walked away with an insight that's helped me. So I think this is going to be a great conversation. So first, tell us, how'd you get started in public education?
Well, it's a little bit serendipitous, but I was working downtown in Wilmington on 30th Street, believe it or not, in an old factory building that belonged to the Speakman Company. And we had put it up for sale. And a gentleman came by, almost like there was a for sale sign outside, and came in and said, I see this building's for sale. I'm interested in buying it for a school. And it was terrific. And that gentleman's name was Will Robinson, and he was the founder of EastSide Charter School.
Wow.
And he had grown out of his current location. Fortunately, it did not follow through because this was a factory and it was old and it needed a lot of repair. But Eastside took over the Martin Luther King Elementary School in the Colonial School District, which is right on Governor Prince, and it's there to this day. But that was my sort of introduction to Delaware public education and what Will Robinson was doing. It led to me joining the board at Eastside Charter, which I spent over a decade on that board, and learned a lot. And as you probably well aware, Aaron Bass is the current head of school at Eastside Charter. It's doing wonderful. It's linked in with Reach Riverside and the work that Logan Herron's doing down there. So it's really a great story, and that was my first introduction to public education in Delaware.
That's a fabulous story. I had no idea. What year was that he?
Gosh, it's more than 20 years. As I said, there's a lot of experience here, but it must have been like 2004, 2005.
Wow. But that's 2 decades of you to remain committed to public education in the state. And I think that's fabulous. I think the solution here, whatever we're going to do to move Delaware forward, takes a contribution from everyone who lives in the state. And I think that's a remarkable story. And I would agree. Aaron is a fabulous leader. He's doing a fantastic job. And the board is also an admirable board, the board of Eastside Charter.
Oh, Charlie McDowell, John. There's a whole host of folks that have really been dedicated to this for years.
So that's how you got started. I think there are others at CSC that share your interest in supporting public education.
Yeah, Julie, you were talking about CSC where I work currently, and it's just a wonderful company, 125 years old, 8,000 employees around the world. But Delaware is the headquarters, and it's one of our largest offices, and we have this belief that that we need to work in the communities in which we work and live. And so public education is something a lot of people here care a lot about. And so we mentioned EastSide. So today, although I'm no longer on the EastSide board, we have a woman named Kristen Dieno who runs our human resources department. She sits on that board and provides a lot of
Mhm.
insight for them. And you mentioned Rodell, which I was just a really, Delaware's lucky to have the Rodell Foundation, the work that Paul and Byer do, and the rest of that team. And we have a lawyer here, a woman named Brenda Wise, who now currently sits on that board as well. And so there's
Wow.
a couple examples, but across the company, not only in Delaware, but our other locations, people are involved, and a number of people are involved in public education.
Hmm. That's great. No, I would agree with you too. I think Rodell's work and the contribution that they've made to advancing, particularly in this, that most recently with early childhood education, but also with the workforce development and the career pipeline has been fabulous. I respect both of them.
Yeah, that Pathways program, that just continues to develop and is is an example for other places around the United States. And frankly, some of
Hmm.
those ideas, I know Paul, had gone over to look outside the United States for some of those ideas. So I would
Hmm.
agree.
Yeah. So you're on the board of Delaware Can as well, which is a different kind of education focused nonprofit.
Yeah, that came through my involvement with Rodell and Delaware Can Campaign for Action Now. It's part of a national organization called 50 Can and really focused on education and education reform. And today, our executive director, Brittany Mumford, has been there for a few years. And when you think about, the collaboration and coordination around Delaware education, I think Delaware Can's done a great job getting more involved. I know, for example, they work very closely with the Delaware Charter School Network, for example,
Hmm.
and the
Hmm.
work that Kendall Massett's doing, and even the work
Hmm.
that you're doing at First State Educate. And so,
Yeah.
it's a good ecosystem that's sort of helping to move Delaware public education forward.
Yep, I would agree. Kendall and Brittany were one of the first people that I met when I came back to Delaware, and so they've really helped a lot in having me navigate for that first year to know sort of what's what and where's where. Do you think that there's more opportunities for collaboration, like in this ecosystem? Kind of what I've found with Rodell, with Delaware Cam, with Delaware Charter School Network, like there's a willingness to collaborate, and I feel I'd love your perspective that when we're kind of united and aligned, maybe not with the same exact focus, but with common goals or a shared, general trajectory, we can kind of achieve more.
Wholeheartedly, I agree in the sense that, and the common goals, I mean, look, we're talking about educating the future workforce. We're talking about our children. We're talking about Delaware's livelihood and future. And so it's very easy to get behind these large goals to, improve education. And then, how you go about that. One of the things that really interests me, and you mentioned that in the introduction, that I co-chair the Delaware Prosperity Partnership, Governor Carney, and and it's been such a effective tool for developing uh, Delaware's economy. That would be a separate podcast. But what it has been doing is bringing the private sector more involved in economic development. And I think
Mhm,
that's an interesting model when you think about education and what is the private sector's role and how do we get involved? Because at
mhm,
the end of the day, when we talk about private sector, we're talking about all the citizens in Delaware. We're talking about all those families, and it's their children that are being educated.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I would love to see that from the first aid educate perspective. I would love to see, an expanded definition of what collaboration looks like, so that school boards across the state could benefit from that. I think the vocational model does a very good job of strategically identifying who sits on those boards to help the districts achieve specific goals and outcomes. And I think there's a lot to bear. There's a lot of talent and a lot of great people in Delaware who I think want to be part of the solution.
It's very interesting. Yesterday, I was just with a fellow at Leadership Delaware, and I don't know how familiar you are with that organization, but it's been now in place for more than 10 years, and it's just a remarkable organization to develop future leaders in Delaware. And one of the things it does is create a pipeline
Hmm.
for folks in the private sector to get more involved in things like school board races,
Hmm.
and get involved in their communities. And so, these are the kinds of examples that we need to foster and really develop and help grow, because
Hmm.
it's LDI is just a really great organization here in Delaware.
It is. It made a tremendous contribution, and I think what's great about the example is that it's normalized this idea that to become a leader and to cultivate talent, it takes a strategic effort. So when we think about school boards in Delaware, a pipeline that helps people get prepared to sit in that seat seems so logical. And this LDI is a case in point where it really has had a tremendous impact on the state.
Yeah, and they talk about in that connecting the dots, and I think, organizations like that, again, it exposes folks to public education. I mean, they through their program, they meet with superintendents and the Secretary of Education and a whole host of
Hmm.
folks, and learn what the opportunities, and then they realize that they do have certain skills that are transferable, and we'll talk about that in
Right.
a moment, to board,
Hmm.
to running for school boards and being part of it, and then that they can be part of the solution. So it's
Right.
just, yeah, it's just great to see.
So yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that because to pivot to the next topic, board governance, right? What does it take to be a board member? You've had for 2 decades now leadership roles on various boards, and you've seen this from a variety of perspectives, both in education and in economic development. But what do you think are sort of the primary roles, responsibilities that a board member has?
Well, it, we're in Delaware, and as you know, Delaware is the home of most of the Fortune 500 companies, and so and we have a very strong court of chancery and judiciary. If you've been watching the news, and Elon Musk might not agree, but we have a
Right.
hundred year precedent, and it's really remarkable. So. I think that some of the examples that we see on corporate boards and what we
Hmm.
see are transferable for sure for school boards. But as any good corporate lawyer will tell you, that a somebody who serves on corporate has three responsibilities, and that's duty of care,
Hmm.
duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. And when you break that down to sort of, it's just common sense. This idea of care, you have to take sort of this responsibility, and that ultimately that care and what you do and how you
Hmm.
do it. You have to bring that loyalty to the organization, right? And then you're
Hmm.
you're looking out for that organization and keep it. And then sort of obedience. The sense, the strong word, but what it means is following. You're going to follow the rules and keep.
Hmm.
We can talk about compliance as well, but just
Hmm.
those kinds of responsibilities. So in a very broad way, those become, say, what are the primary responsible board member? And
Hmm.
I think they're very transferable. And certainly I've sat on private company boards, but I've also sat on a number of nonprofits, as we've talked about, and those have steered me well, as in that
Hmm.
role. Yeah.
I love that it becomes so simple, right? And I think that's really important, especially for our listening audience, that, what does it mean to be a board member? It might seem like this, concept that needs to be demystified. No one really knows what you're supposed to do. But when you state it so clearly with just these three principles, and that guides everything that you do when you're in the seat.
I think, yeah, yeah. I mean, you are not expected to come in as the expert, right? And
Hmm.
what you're expected is to bring your experience and your judgment and your curiosity, and you do those things, and live up to that. You can be very, very effective.
Yeah, I love that, you bring your judgment, your experiences, and your and curiosity. I think one thing I've learned with through all of my experiences is that it's sort of not assuming that I understand exactly what's going on and kind of asking a couple questions has proved to be extremely beneficial. But sometimes people, when you're sitting on a stage and everyone's looking at you, it's really, really hard to ask a question because I think it's not very different than I remember being in school, like in elementary school. Like you don't want to be the one to raise your hand and ask the question because you think you're the only one with the question.
And it just takes that little bit of, just to put yourself out there and put yourself forward. You always hear that expression, there's no such thing as a dumb question.
Right.
I think sometimes there are dumb questions, like if you're not listening, and then all of a sudden you ask a question that somebody just answered for. But I mean, what they mean by that is exactly what you said, is like, are you willing to, you ask sort of a basic question. And as you know, sometimes these basic questions are critical. Why are we here? What are we trying to
Right.
accomplish?
Right.
Because
Right.
this doesn't make sense to me. And as you said, if you think that, I would say the majority of the people sitting there are asking that same question, and that gets
Hmm.
it out, so you can have a good dialogue about it. And it just takes that curiosity and then a little bit of courage. But
Mhm.
yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Yeah, curiosity, courage, and I think too what helped what I just got a little bit of insight for you're saying, I was thinking about the listener or the respondent to the question, and I think equally for that person to not feel like they're defending. If someone asks a question, it doesn't necessarily mean that someone's calling into question what they're saying. They're really just looking for clarity, right? So if we could stay in a safe space for that kind of dialogue,
Yeah,
probably
no, I
more
think,
productive.
seek to understand, right? And I think
Mhm.
in this case, things that you should be your own sort of awareness of tone as an example,
Yeah,
right? I mean, tone is a big driver of like how you ask a question and how you challenge. And I think we have to take some personal responsibility of that. But like just to again go out and ask those questions and in trying to understand more and it always leads to productive conversations,
right,
especially on a
right.
board. Yeah.
So productive conversations. I would love to hear some examples, or maybe some, examples of what worked really, really well, or kind of what to avoid. But when boards work well together, what's present? What's there?
Hmm.
We talked about a couple, right? This curiosity and a little bit of courage, and
Hmm.
so what other things do you think are essential?
Yeah, so as we've talked about, especially around education, I've been on a number of boards. You talked about the Rodell Foundation,
Hmm.
EastSide Charter, uh, currently Delaware Can on the advisory board, and a common theme, and I would say in many respects those boards have worked well. Sometimes I was on them for long periods of time, so they've had their ups and downs. But first is this like back to this like sort of duty of care, but it's this personal responsibility if you decide to do this, you have to show up. I mean,
Mm,
there's no alternative. I mean, in terms of, and I think virtual helps because it makes us more available. But you have to say, okay, I'm going to dedicate that time. And in most situations, it's not a significant amount of time, right? Once a month, there's some pre-work to do, but yeah, but you have to dedicate that time, and really, and then again, there's a sort of education for your own responsibility and
mm,
meeting with board members or other folks outside for a cup of coffee and asking them,
mhm,
what they think and building up those relationships
yeah,
outside that board meeting is so critical because
mhm,
oftentimes you get into the board meeting and you're talking about some a contentious issue or something that needs to be challenged, and so you want to know that you've built that trust with the rest of
mhm,
your,
mhm.
or, you know, I I was. It was wonderful to attend the First State Educate event the other night, and you
Thank
gave out
you.
a micro grant, and the purpose of that micro grant was to get board members from school boards meeting each other and talking with each other,
Right,
and
exactly.
and that ultimately is the idea of building trust, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're on the board and stuff, and people you know, if you reach out and you say, "Gosh, I'm new to the board, love to have a cup of coffee, love to just
Mhm.
have a phone call," that just goes so far
Sure.
to building that success. And the successful boards, they challenge each other, that's for
Mhm.
sure. But they do that with a sense of again being, let's be hard on the issues, not hard on the people,
Yeah.
and let's do that because we've built trust and we all are focused on the
Mhm.
same thing, the success of the organization.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I agree. I think the trust is critical. There's a book. A superintendent from Colonial had mentioned to me, like, work happens at the speed of trust, or something like this. Is that really you can't move forward if people aren't feeling connected. So, talking about something that's a little bit more recent, and you've had some years to be able to develop this trust, but the at Governor Markell's request, you in the business community, you worked on the Education Funding and Improvement Commission, and then that was tasked with modernizing, the funding formula, and now the school funding is a hot topic.
Yeah, I mean, while there were some successes there, I mean, frankly, I've got to say overall a little bit of more than on frustration in the sense that, Delaware, this podcast, we're not talking about the funding formula or the funding process, but it's a 70-year-old structure.
Hmm.
It lacks I would say the transparency, the accountability, and flexibility that we need, and a lot of us believe we need to move to a more weighted funded formula that most other states have long
Hmm.
had in
Hmm.
place. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I sat on Governor Markell's. It was called EFIC, Education Funding Improvement Commission back in
Mm-hmm.
2016 as sort of the business person representative. Um, you know, I would say we didn't spend the time on that committee. It was brought together for love to really build that trust, and people came in with strong views, and frankly, we didn't make much progress. And so I don't think that it's surprising that now in 2024 there's actually been a new funding commission coming together that is very similar to what we looked at just 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I hold greater promise for this group, partially
Mm-hmm.
because it's backed by, as we all know, this it's uh, uh, a judicial position that was that the state needs to look at this to satisfy an outstanding case.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting to see, and what I think people, the amount of investment in public education is enormous. I mean, we Delaware is in the top quartile of spending, and I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but that's a lot of money, right? So the state contribution alone, before we look at local property taxes and the federal, is somewhere around $3 billion. That's a lot of money, right? And then you have boards that are seated on, and they have their budgets, right, that are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So they've got the state portion that has requirements. They've got the local that you sometimes, and then sometimes they don't have enough money, have to go to referendum, right? And I can imagine. I mean, I remember the first time I had to make a decision where there were that many zeros, and it's scary, right? So and you're leading a multinational company, right? You're making enormous decisions that have global impacts. What how does one build up the confidence to be able to figure out what to invest in and what's the right choice and what's not the right choice when it comes to investing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where this idea we need to be careful. But when we look at this, ongoing open case, that one of the things the requirement was to come up with this report and what's called the AIR report that we've all looked at. And I would say one thing that, from my opinion, a little bit disservice to that report is the headline was that, okay, the state needs to put $600 to $1 billion
Mm-hmm.
of funds into the education system. Now they came up with that sort of formulaically, but I think if you look at it carefully, there's a lot of room to sort of test that, to look at it and say, I just don't think that should have been the headline of the report.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when we look at those kinds of large kind of investments, you do it very carefully, right? You look and
Mm-hmm.
say, and you know that you're making a decision that can last a decade, 2 decades,
Right.
and so your assumptions, you spend a lot of time testing those assumptions. You don't sort of
Mm-hmm.
put them out there and just say, oh yeah, this is approximately correct, and you see that all the time in capital investment. And I think
Mm-hmm.
the state does a good job of that, when it looks at building a new school, right? And
Mm-hmm.
how you can look at the what's been going on in terms of looking at new high school in Wilmington, and they've been very
Mm-hmm.
thoughtful of that process. So
Yeah.
I think that's the key, and so I think we have the capability to do it, and you just got to sit down and really it's go through the details.
Yeah, and the CFOs at the district level, some of them are absolutely amazing, being able to just explain the complex budget. So for me, I think, being comfortable if I were a board member and someone was presenting what the budget for the next year would be, I'm really looking for who else around me can help me make sense of what this is, right? And how can I set a goal? How will I know in a year, right? If the outcome, like you said, I agree, it could be a decade later that it still has effects, but what am I looking for in the short term to be like, well, we spent this much, we spent $30 million on new textbooks. Did it work? Right? Should I buy more? Should I try something different? I think these are difficult decisions.
Very much. I think in coming out of COVID, I mean, I think we're all scratching our heads to say what happened to the funding that went to public education, not only across the country, but in Delaware, and say
Hmm.
what was, using a business term, return on investment.
Right.
And so, but yeah, we have people that understand. I mean, through the years, I worked with David Bowman, who came out of the Brandywine School District in
Hmm.
Nexon, who was,
Hmm.
doing work there and doing something else. So we've got some great talent. There's many more, as you said, that can
Hmm.
help. They can help do that. And it gets back to this idea of transparency
Hmm.
and accountability, right? I mean, I think that. I think our current system does lack both transparency and accountability,
Hmm.
and that's
Hmm.
something that we can improve.
Yeah. So to move us to our final
Yeah.
segment, we can talk about compliance challenges and compliance. That back end of the house is really what CSC's, an excellent provider of, and really has become a global leader. What do you think is how does a board start to understand what their compliance expectations are? If I'm a new board member and I just got here, how do I even begin to understand what I'm responsible for?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, again, you don't have to come on as an expert.
Hmm.
In my own in the private sector, the work that I do, obviously technology, cybersecurity, all these things are
Hmm.
AI, artificial intelligence, and I'm not expected to be, and I'm surely not the expert in that. So
Hmm.
that being said, I think you need to bring in folks that can help you. So if it's in regulation, in compliance, there are people that understand that. They are people,
Hmm.
and whether it's in the state or outside the state.
Right.
You spend time in Washington, and we're close by, and we've had some great organizations come up talking about what's happening in public education around
Hmm.
the world. So you can there's folks to reach out to and to work. And I think the other thing with this sort of compliance reporting challenge as a board member is that sometimes if something scary comes up, uh, the wrong thing to do is to put something in a drawer and
Right.
then lock the drawer
And
and
think it's
just
gonna go away.
and think it's going to go away. Exactly. Much better to sort of try to understand it, even if you might not be correct, and sort of begin dealing with it because it's not going to go away. And
Right.
and when that drawer gets pried open, you've got a bigger
Mhm.
issue. And so I think that's one of the challenges is again about this duty duty of obedience, right? These things
Sure.
we have to follow through, and I think again, you don't have to be the expert, but you can sort of ask those questions, and keep those things. Look for answers and come to that next meeting and say, "Hey, we discussed this issue
Mhm.
last time.
Mhm.
How did we make progress?" So
Yeah. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's sort of an ongoing process. There's always something new to learn. There's always something changing in the industry, in the marketplace, that people have to kind of keep learning all the time to keep up.
yeah, I mean that's the thing. It's you're never you think it's always that you're finished, but it's ongoing, right? And
Yeah.
and whether it's it's the curriculum or whether it's all the different things that were related around running that those districts, which are so complicated, right? I mean, in terms
Yes.
of or just the amount of different things are related to that.
Yeah. And so one thing for First Aid Educate, and you know this, but for the audience, right? Our sole mission is to build capacity in the boards. There's no judgment, there's no criticism. We really just want to be this repository of information. And there are some things, like you said, there are national experts, and we're working with them trying to build out a library. But there's also a lot of expertise right here in Delaware. I'm going to do a podcast with Jim Taylor, who shed so much light. The topic was ethical decision making, and how does a board member kind of, how to look at a situation. And so really what we want to do is kind of provide access to information. So boards are going to have any number of questions about things, and just want to, say to the audience, we're here. This is what we're here for. So if there's a topic that's of interest, please let us know.
No, and it's been missing for a long time in the state. And the work that you guys are doing is just remarkable. As I said, I was just attended your recent sort of annual event, and
Hmm.
just to look at all the folks there, and as we talked earlier, getting people together, talking about these peer-to-peer groups. Anytime you can
Yeah,
get together with your peers and say what's working, what's not working, uh,
exactly.
and so just kudos to all the work that you guys are doing, and it keeps improving, it keeps getting better and more
Right.
engaged, and expands every year.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Thanks for that. We're trying. I think we've met a lot of really interested partners. And I think, like I said in the beginning, this is a space where everyone can make a contribution. This is big enough that there's room for everybody to pick up their piece. Right. And we want to facilitate that to the degree we can. So in closing, I really appreciate the time you've spent with us today. Like I said in the beginning, I always learn so much from you. I think you've had tremendous experience, and I'm grateful that you took the time to have this conversation to share with others who might not have a chance to bump into you, to sort of learn from that. In closing, any sort of big tips, advice you'd want to say, just generally, maybe not to specifically to a board member, but someone in a leadership position, someone who's got the burden of this responsibility in front of them.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to keep that optimism, right? I mean, it's like we are making very good progress in this state, and we have a lot of challenges and there's stuff, and sometimes we get caught looking in the minutia and the details and some of the history of how we got here. But it's that it's just a really exciting time.
Hmm.
And especially when you look at and it's more it's important as ever. You think about our business, uh, at CSC, we probably have the majority of the high schools. People that work here at CSC went to
Oh,
majority of the high schools in Delaware,
uh-huh.
certainly in Newcastle County, and that team that we have here competes worldwide. And so, just it's never been more important to have just a really robust, strong public education system. And so yeah, to anyone that's listening and stuff, it's like get involved. Bring your best self, bring that curiosity, and that involvement and judgment, and I think it'll pay back the state for decades to come,
Yep.
for sure.
Yep, I agree. So you've left me with a lot of really good tidbits. This through the 3 points about what's aboard and being curious, and the complexities of an investment and thinking through assumptions. So many great pieces of advice that you share with, and I have enjoyed the time that I spent with you. So I want to thank you for being with us today.
Joy, you're very, very welcome. That was a lot of fun and a lot of work to do.
Yeah, well, we have a lot, and I look forward to doing some of it with you. But your dedication to Delaware's education and economic growth is really inspiring. Thank you, and thank you all for joining us again on the Leading Together podcast.